I'm still afraid.
Stop it now, I mean it.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
In 1968, George A. Romero and John Russo collaborated to write The Night of the Living Dead, one of the greatest movies of all time, essentially creating what we all know as the modern zombie, and changing horror forever. Romero directed the film, and it has gone on to become one of the most copied and referenced horror movies of all time. Romero would go on to make a sequel 10 years later, called Dawn of the Dead. This is one of the greatest sequels of all time, in any genre, taking everything that made the original great and enhancing it, bringing it into the modern day of the time. It doesn't have any of the same characters as the original, but it takes place around 3 weeks after the events of it, and carries on the same themes of paranoia and survival, while also poking fun at American consumerism in the process. The third film in the series, Day of the Dead, came out in 1985, and takes place 5 years after the events of the first two. Romero gave us another incredible film here, really nailing down the classic theme of zombie cinema that humans are really just as bad as the undead. And that sounds simple enough. 3 movies over 17 years, a nice and simple trilogy. But in reality, that is just the surface level to one of the most convoluted and outrageous franchise canons that I have ever seen. The confusion starts from the very beginning with 1968's The Night of the Living Dead. This film was written by George Romero and John Russo. After the film's success, the two could not agree on a direction to take the franchise, so they agreed to split apart and each take the franchise in their own direction. Romero was allowed to make his movies, but was not allowed to use the words Living Dead in the sequels, which is why they dropped that word after the original. Russo retained the rights of the Living Dead name, so he went on to create the Return of the Living Dead series in the 80s. The Return of the Living Dead was directed by Dan O'Bannon, and came out in 1985, the same year as the third Romero film, Day of the Dead. To make things even more confusing, in Return of the Living Dead, they talk about the original Night of the Living Dead as a movie. But in the story, that original film is a movie that was based on a true story in their world. So they are referencing the first film of the series as both a movie and as an actual canon event.
Did you see that movie, Night of the Living Dead?
Yeah. That's the one where the corpses start eating the people, right? Sure. What about it?
Did you know that movie was based on a true case?
Oh, come on, you're shitting me, right?
I ain't never been more serious in my life.
The Return of the Living Dead takes a much more comedic approach than the Romero ones, and they do it to perfection. The first one is a B-movie masterpiece, and is really one of my personal favorites of the whole Dead franchise. This was followed up by Return of the Living Dead Part 2 in 1988, which served as a sort of soft reboot of the first Return movie, even though it had some of the same characters. And then the trilogy was concluded in 1993 with Part 3. A decade later, the series was reborn with Return of the Living Dead Necropolis and Return of the Living Dead Rave to the Grave, which is a movie where college students take a drug called Z, which resurrects the living dead, who wreak havoc on their Halloween rave. Those 5 are the official Return of the Living Dead line, but Russo wasn't done contributing to this mad continuity. In 1998, he went back and reshot new scenes into the original Night of the Living Dead, and added a new opening, an entire subplot, and a brand new score. This was called the Night of the Living Dead 30th Anniversary Edition, and he followed that up with another Living Dead film called Children of the Living Dead. But I'm not really sure how that one relates to the other 5, if at all. Around this same time, Romero actually went back to his Dead franchise, and gave us a new trilogy of films, adding to his original canon. There was Land of the Dead in 2005, Diary of the Dead in 2007, and Survival of the Dead in 2009. Now I hope you all are paying attention because things are just getting started. In 1990, Night of the Living Dead was remade by the legendary Tom Savini, who actually worked on the makeup for the original Dawn and Day movies. This is the only one of the remakes that Romero had his hand in, and he actually rewrote the screenplay for it. In 2004, Dawn of the Dead was remade by Zack Snyder. And even though this was a remake of 1978's Dawn of the Dead, which was a sequel to 1968's Night of the Living Dead, this 2004 version was not a direct sequel to the 1990 version of Night of the Living Dead. And this 2004 version of Dawn of the Dead was directed by Zack Snyder. And that is not to be confused with Zack Snyder's other movie, Army of the Dead, which has no relation to the series at all. In 2008, Steve Miner directed a remake of Day of the Dead. This remake had no relation at all to the 2004 Dawn of the Dead, even though these movies both somehow starred Ving Rhames, who played a different character in each. Due to the original film being in the public domain, and a number of different studios owning the rights to various different naming rights and aspects of the sequels, there were also a bunch of unofficial sequels and spin-offs as well. There was Day of the Dead 2 Contagion, which was a direct sequel to the 1985 one, Night of the Living Dead 3D, which was a remake of the original, and this movie had a sequel called Night of the Living Dead 3D Reanimation, not to be confused with the unrelated Night of the Living Dead Reanimated, which was an animated remake of the original. And neither of these should be confused with the animated and 3D reimagining of the original called Night of the Living Dead Darkest Dawn. And while we're at it, I'll throw in another animated one called Night of the Animated Dead that came out in 2021. There was also Mimesis Night of the Living Dead, which was a sequel or side story to the original. Bill Hinzman, who played the original zombie from the very first scene of Night of the Living Dead, made his own semi-related zombie movie in 1988 called Flesh Eater. You have Night of the Living Dead Resurrection, which is another remake of the original, except set in Wales, and another remake of Day called Day of the Dead Bloodline, and then finally, Night of the Living Dead Rebirth, which came out in 2020. On top of all this, there were also so many films that paid homage to the Dead series, and even parodied it. We all know Edgar Wright's classic Shaun of the Dead, but there also was Night of the Day of the Dawn, Poultrygeist, Night of the Chicken Dead, Dance of the Dead, and Zone of the Dead. And then there's the 2017 mockumentary-style Japanese film One Cut of the Dead, which spawned a spin-off called One Cut of the Dead in Hollywood, and another one called One Cut of the Dead Mission Remote. And because why not, that original Japanese One Cut of the Dead was remade in France last year called Final Cut. And again, none of this is to be confused with The Walking Dead, The Evil Dead, or The City of the Dead, which none of them are related at all. Now, as crazy as all this may seem, we're about to take it even more international, and it's going to get crazy. Let's go all the way back to the original 1978 Dawn of the Dead, the official second film in the franchise. Over in Italy, the film was re-edited by the legendary Dario Argento, and re-released under the name Zombie. This version was such a hit in Italy that it spawned a sequel of its own called Zombie 2. Now I know what you're thinking, why is it called Zombie 2 when it's the sequel to the second film in the franchise? Wouldn't that make it Zombie 3? Well, just hold on to your hats because it's going to get a little wonky from here on out. So first of all, Zombie 2 actually is a prequel to Dawn, and it's honestly really awesome. I personally think it's on par with the original Romero 3. It was directed by Italian horror legend Lucio Fulci, and he followed that up with Zombie 3 in 1988. Fulci also made the movie The City of the Living Dead in 1980. This film doesn't have anything to do with the Dead series, or the Living Dead series, but was actually the first in Fulci's unrelated Gates of Hell trilogy. In 1983, City of the Living Dead was released in America under the name Twilight of the Dead, but they were hit with a cease and desist because it was too close a name to Romero's trilogy, so it was renamed as The Gates of Hell. Now going back to the main series, Dawn, Zombie 2, and Zombie 3 are the official Italian zombie series, but these films were being released differently in different countries, and it seems like everyone wanted their zombie movie to be a part of the zombie series. In the UK, they completely ignored the Dawn of the Dead, which was supposedly the first in that series, and instead decided to release Zombie 2 under the name Zombie Flesh Eaters, and Zombie 3 under the name Zombie Flesh Eaters 2. And then a completely unrelated movie called After Death was released as Zombie Flesh Eaters 3. The Thai zombie series follows the titling and numbering of the British series, but also adds the unrelated movie Killing Birds, with the new title Zombie Flesh Eaters 4. I really don't know what Australia was thinking, because they for some reason started with Zombie 4, and their series would consist of unrelated, renamed Italian horror movies. There was Zombie 4 Panic, Zombie 5 Vengeance, Zombie 6 The Mirage, Zombie 7 Last Rites, and Zombie 8 Urban Decay, which weirdly was the only Australian original film in the series. That seventh film, Last Rites, was also weirdly the fourth film in a completely separate series called The Blind Dead, and the movie was originally called Night of the Seagulls. In America, we somehow screwed it up even worse. We started off with Zombie 2, but we released it as just Zombie, and then we released Zombie 3 as Zombie 3, so there was just no Zombie 2 in America. And then we included After Death and Killing Birds as the 4th and 5th installments. In the 90s, with the rise of VHS and home video, production companies were able to just slap any name on their films, I guess, because there was a bunch of unofficial films released in the zombie line too. You had Zombie 3, Return of the Zombies, which was originally a 1973 Spanish film called The Hanging Woman, Zombie 4, A Virgin of the Living Dead, which was a French film. The same guy who directed that one, Jesus Franco, also directed 1983's Revenge of the House of Usher, which at one point was released as Zombie 5. 1980's Zombie Holocaust was once released under the name Zombie 3, and even had the same star as Zombie 2. An Italian film called Hell of the Living Dead was released at one point in Italy as Zombie 4, and in America as Zombie 5 Ultimate Nightmare. Zombie 6 Monster Hunter, which was originally an Italian film called Absurd, and that was originally a sequel to the movie Anthropophagus, which was at one point released as Zombie 7, and featured the same actress as the original Zombie 2. On top of that, you had 1974's Let Sleeping Corpses Lie, which at one point was released as Zombie 3. A movie called Nightmare City was also at one point Zombie 3, as well as a 1981 flick called Burial Ground. 1982's Oasis of the Zombies was released as Zombie 6. A 1985 North Korean film called Pulgasari was released in Pakistan under the name Zombie 34, the communist bull monster, even though it supposedly has nothing to do with zombies at all. A 1991 movie called Zombie 90, Extreme Pestilence, was once released as Zombie 7, and a 1995 Dutch short film called Zombie 1, and a 2020 short film called Variant were both released as Zombie 8. And I think that just about does it. I'm sure by the time I release this video there will be 3 or 4 more entries into the zombie series, and I probably missed a few as it is, but for now that's the best I could do. If you enjoyed the video and want to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, that is always appreciated. If you like hip hop, make sure to check out my main channel, Def Goldblum. I'd like to give a special shout out to my patrons as always. Let me know down in the comments what is your favorite entry into this series. And as always, I got a lot more headed your way, so stay tuned, stay safe, and stay def. Thanks for watching.